Hello, everybody. This is George Michaelopoulos, also known as Monomachos, and doing an interview. Been very honored to have received an invitation. Actually, I invited Mr. James Perloff, who we interviewed last year on the whole COVID crisis. He wrote a very good book about it. And now he just wrote another one, which unfortunately I don't have with me, but it's called Missing Saints. Looks like Gail wanted to read it, so I'll take it from my desk. Anyway, so it's a nice, easy to read book, and it is a research, a well done research by Mr. Perloff about the Synaxarion, which I believe is about 4,000 pages spread over 7 volumes. So, Jim, how are you doing? Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, although your voice cuts out occasionally on me.
Okay, let me see if I can.
Sometimes I just get part of the words you say.
Okay, it may be because cinder block walls around here. Anyway, is this better? Is this better, Jim? Okay, let me see if I can raise the let me see if I can, is this any better? Is this better? How about this? How about?
It's about the same. You're still cutting out on me sometime. I'm hearing part of what you say.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. I'll talk slow. Maybe you'll catch everything.
Okay.
Anyway.
Right now it's pretty good.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So anyway, as I was saying, Mr. Perloff, James Perloff, has written several books. The most recent one is called Missing Saints. It's a, if I may be so flippant, and I don't mean to be casual, it's a exposition of, it's his research of 4,000 pages of the Synaxarion, which is fascinating. However, the book itself is a little over 100 pages. It can be read in 2 days. So James, if you don't mind me asking, let's get started. So first of all, why the Synaxarion, or why Missing Saints? Can you tell us a little bit about that, about your research and the impetus? What caused you to want to?
George, I've only heard about 1/3 of your words there.
Oh, darn.
I gather you're asking me about why I wrote this book.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. Yes. Yeah. Oh, darn.
Well, the reason I wrote the book is that America's in a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah.
Culturally, economically, health-wise, we seem to be on the precipice of destruction. And I myself have been aware for 44 years now that America is actually under the control of an oligarchy that hides itself behind the facade of democracy,
right,
making the people think they're in charge. And they've been bringing this down for a long time. I have many books that I've written on this, starting with The Shadows of Power, which I wrote in 1988, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which I wrote in 2013, and supplemented that with my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, in 2019. But after 44 years, I felt that the oligarchs are so deeply entrenched now in their control of government, media, intelligence services, that even though I'm very impressed by the worldwide outcry against Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates, it looks like the powers that be, the deep state as we call them, are so fully in control that, and we're an unprecedented surveillance state. Any kind of worldwide revolution is going to be cut off before it really gets underway. And I felt that our best chance for defeating this satanic system, which it is satanic to any who have spent any time studying it, our best defense would be supplications for divine intervention, which has been accomplished in the past by what the Orthodox Church commemorates as saints. And so that's how I came to write this new little book, Missing Saints, Missing Miracles. It's based on the lives of the saints.
Well, first of all, it's very readable, and it's very enlightening. And even though I've been raised in the faith all my life, I learned some stuff. It was kind of surprising to me, in which I thank you. And I can't recommend our viewers buying it. It should be mandatory reading, as far as I'm concerned. Required reading. That's the word I'm looking for. So when we talk about saints, there's lots of different saints, and you go through the different categories. Can you hear me okay now?
Mhm.
Okay. One thing you did, which
Yeah, I'm hearing you pretty good.
Okay. One thing that you did, which I really appreciated, was the fact that you went through all the different miracles of Jesus and or sayings of Jesus regarding miracles. Like, for instance, you can say to this mountain, remove yourself from hence, and it will go hither. And then you actually give examples of saints who effected these miracles. And of course, on the cover of your book is St. George, and I'm George, and of course, he's a famous dragon slayer. But I didn't realize there were many such dragon slayers in the Synaxarion, not just George. And I want to thank you for putting that out. Hello? Did you want to
say? What I do in this book, and I may be wrong, I think it might be the only book that's done this. I took the miracles that were done by saints, and I organized them by miracle, and I showed which saint did a miracle, when and where, to the best of our knowledge. Sometimes we know the exact city and year. Sometimes we just know the century and the country that they did it in. But I'm a new Orthodox. I became baptized and chrismated in 2017. I had a whole history before then. I grew up agnostic, in an agnostic home where we didn't worship God at all. And at age 20, I was an atheist. And then from 72 to 82, I got into a new age cult, which was viciously anti-Christian. They used to mock Christians all the time. And then in 83, I finally got out of that cult, and I came to Christ. But I started attending the evangelical churches, and we can get into the problems of the evangelical churches. But in 2017, I finally, after hearing a lot of unbiblical things in the evangelical churches, I started seeking out the true faith, and I found that was an Orthodoxy, which has remained unchanged, essentially, since Constantine legalized Christian Orthodoxy, Christianity, in the 4th century. And we still, of course, use St. John Chrysostom's liturgy from the 4th century. And I said, that's the way I want to worship. I want to worship the way the original Christians did. I don't want to worship in some spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off of Martin Luther, which is what most Christians in America are doing today. I could go over the various reasons I joined Orthodoxy. There were many of them, but that's not the main point of my book. My main point of the book was that miracles have really two main points of my new book are that there's a lot of Christian history that Western Christians don't know about. You find in the Synaxarion. I got Saint Paisios, probably the most respected saint of the Greek Orthodox Church in the 20th century. He said, every day you should read for the lives of the saints. And I said, okay, if Saint Paisios says that, that's good advice. So I bought one volume of the Synaxarion, and I thought, okay, this is pretty amazing. I'm learning stuff about Christianity and miracles I never knew before.
Right.
And then I bought a second volume, and I said, this should be a blog post. And I bought a third volume. I said, no, I got to read the entire Synaxarion, all 4,000 pages. And I got to write a book about this, because Western Christians need to know the truth about the history of Christianity.
Well, I agree. And your book is very systematic. It's almost a catechism in itself. It's not just about the saints, their miracles, comparison to what Jesus said, but you also write about the I don't want to say this word, but I've got to say it. I guess the spiritual defects of evangelical Protestantism and even of Catholicism, and you put it out in a very nice manner. You know, you're not beating somebody over the head with it or stuff like that. And I appreciate it because, you know, as you know, we Orthodox have our own defects as well, but not in worship or theology.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, and I am curious. I mean, so you were, you know, agnostic, New Ager, evangelical for 30 years. What, and you talked about what made you finally go into Orthodoxy. Was there a specific light going off in your head, or did you go to a church someday with a friend, or was it? Expound on that if you don't mind.
I'm glad you asked me that. And, you know, to talk about why I came to Orthodoxy, I need to also talk about the history of the church itself.
Right.
So as you know, for the first 1,000 years after the resurrection, it's basically one Christian church. Now there was, you know, a schism here or there, and there were some heresies which were denied by the 7 ecumenical councils.
Right.
And however, basically there was one Christian church, and one thing I really I appreciate is the history of the Orthodox Church written by Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived from 260 AD to 340 AD. And he talks about in there, pardon me, I'm using some notes. He talks about a Christian named Hegesippus. Hegesippus was a Christian. He went from city to city. He went to Corinth. He went to Rome. He went to various cities. And this is the 2nd century AD. And everywhere he went, he found that the Christian doctrine was the same. The apostles knew what they were doing. They were guided by the Holy Spirit. We know that from the Bible. They planted churches, and they were consistent in the way they worshiped and their doctrine. It wasn't like today where you go from one church in North America to another, and the doctrine is very different, you know, crazy. Okay, so in 1054, the East and West split in Constantinople and Rome, because the Pope, who had always been given the highest seat of honor, demanded that he have the sole voice. And that was not in accordance with what had been done at the previous 7 ecumenical councils, always based on a vote. The Pope was given the highest seat of honor. He was not an exclusive decision maker. So with all respect to my Catholic friends, the church split at that point. And from that point on, from 1054 AD, the only exposure the West had to Christianity was from the Vatican. The Eastern Church was totally forgotten. In the meantime, almost a little less than 500 years later, Martin Luther came along, and however good his complaints may have been against the Catholic Church, what he did was to start the splintering of Western Christianity into hundreds of pieces, denomination after denomination. You just take Henry VIII, he started the Anglican Church because the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. How ridiculous is that? You know, and so when America was founded, you know, back in, you know, the colonizers came in the 17th century, Orthodoxy had no place at all. We weren't around, and you know, Christianity kind of to splinter in. Where I like to pick it up is actually in the 19th century. You know, I've written 2 books on Darwinism, and one of them is called Tornado in a Junkyard, which came out in 1999. Now, I'm going to
good book. I recommend. I highly recommend those books as well.
Thank you. I want to give you a quote from Charles Darwin from 1873. Here's what he said. Quote, Lyell, and he's talking about his evolutionary geologist friend Charles Lyell, says, Lyell is most firmly convinced he's shaken the faith in the deluge, meaning the biblical flood, far more efficiently by never having said a word against the Bible than had he acted otherwise. I have lately read Morley's Life of Voltaire, and he insisted strongly that direct attacks on Christianity, even when written with a wonderful force and vigor of Voltaire, produced little permanent effect. real good seems to only follow the slow and silent side attacks. So here's the point. Darwin was admitting that his purpose wasn't science. His purpose was to shake people's faith in the biblical account of creation by saying that life came about by chance, and in his time, in Victorian times, it was not popular to attack Christianity directly. As you said, you've got to introduce a silent attack. So he didn't Darwin never attacked the Bible directly. He just said that here's how life began. And here's what he said on the Origin of Species. He said that life began with when cells were formed by chemicals randomly coming together in ancient waters. Now, let me just talk about this for a minute. I've written 2 whole books on this, but
please do so.
First of all, science is based on observation. Has anyone ever actually seen chemicals come together and form a living cell? No. Zero observations to back this up. Secondly, cells, according to Darwin, were quite simple. Just get a little carbon and a few other chemicals, blah, blah, blah. He didn't know about the genetic code. He didn't know about DNA. Now, in my books, I quote Sir Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA, and he said that he looked at proteins, and even one simple cell, we can call it simple, has thousands of proteins, and each protein is based on hundreds of amino acids, which have to be in the exact right order. And he calculated the odds of getting one protein by chance in the ancient ocean, as Darwin would have suggested, are 1 in 10 to the power of 260. Which according to any mathematician is impossible. Right? And the one more thing I'm going to say about this, Darwin never explained, even if this first cell came about by chance, before it died in the span of its lifetime, it would have had to develop the process of cellular reproduction. Right. Because if it didn't, there never would have been a second cell. Now, these points of logic are not pointed out in school. Instead, in school, people are simply taught that cells came about by chance, like Darwin said. What a bunch of baloney. Now, in my books, 21 Junkyard, I have to recommend, if people want my most recent rebuttal of Darwinism, go to my website, jamesperloff.net, and scroll down. It's my most popular interview ever. It's got millions of views. It's called God is Real. And we go through all the holes in Darwin's theory, which are multiple. All right, but before they could attack the Bible directly, they first had to establish Darwin as the paradigm for how life began, without a creator, without God. And then in the late 19th century, you started seeing direct attacks on Christianity. The Rockefellers were behind what they call the modernist movement. They funded seminaries like Rochester University and Union Theological Seminary. And these seminaries taught that the Bible wasn't authoritative. There were never any miracles. There was never a resurrection. And they even cast doubt on the historical existence of Jesus. So I'm going to give you one example of this just to show you.
Please, by all means.
Okay. So in 1922, a graduate of Union Theological named Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in New York. So he gave a sermon and he said that the Bible was not authoritative. There were never any miracles. Jesus did not die on the cross. And he said that anybody who who disagreed with this was intolerant. Well, the First Presbyterian Church expelled them as their pastor. They're outraged by all this heresy. So Harry Emerson Fosdick is pastor of the church. Okay. It was John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller hired Harry Emerson Fosdick to be the pastor of his church, Riverside Church in New York, with a ton of money. And he also paid for 130,000 copies to ministers. And as one last thing, I'll mention that the president of the Rockefeller Foundation was Harry Emerson Fosdick's brother Raymond Fosdick. So you see
Okay.
how the Rockefellers are all tied together?
Yeah,
They're all tied together with the modernist movement. And
yeah.
actually, in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, I have a chapter called The War on Christianity, which goes into this, but you can also read for free, The War on Christianity, Part 1, on my website, jamesperloff.net. Now, I, opposing the modernists, we're called the fundamentalists. The fundamentalists said, we believe the Bible, we believe in Jesus, we believe in the miracles. And there was that kind of conservative church that I attended for more than 30 years. Because I could see the modernist movement was bunk. But what I didn't know was break it anytime you want. The fundamentalist churches were hijacked by the Rothschilds, who were the European banking partners of the Rockefellers.
Right.
And what they did in 1917, they published the Schofield Reference Bible. And the Schofield Reference Bible was to make Christians think they had to support Palestine and create the modern state of Israel, which is not the same as the ancient state of Israel, despite confusion by Christians on this issue.
Right, right.
In 1917, the Schofield Reference Bible was published. That very same year, 1917, came the Balfour Declaration, by which the British government promised the Zionist Federation, specifically addressed to Lord Rothschild, the Balfour Declaration promised that Britain would seize Palestine and create a Jewish homeland there for the Jews. Now, mind you, Britain had never been in Palestine before 1917. Now, it's interesting that in 1917, after the Balfour Declaration, the United States declared war in World War I.
Right, on Germany.
This was a quid pro quo. The Zionists said, we'll bring the United States into the war on Britain's side if Britain will promise to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, I should also mention that 1917 is the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, which, according to the Synaxarion, slaughtered more Orthodox Christians than all the martyrs that had died for Christianity in all the centuries before. Now, I want to mention something here. The Bolsheviks did not seize power in Russia until after the American declaration of war, because the Bolsheviks knew that if the America entered the war before the Tsar abdicated, the Tsar's position in Russia would be so enhanced they wouldn't need to abdicate. So 1917 is a year of the Schofield Reference Bible,
right,
the Balfour Declaration, the American Declaration of War, and finally the Bolshevik Revolution. And these things are not a coincidence. Now, so I was in fundamentalist churches, not realizing they'd been Zionized, but I started to hear some really weird stuff. Okay, we're going back a few years now, but one of the things we were taught was that this is just a temporary period of grace unto Jesus Christ. We're going back to a Jewish era with Jewish animal sacrifices. And I said, how can that be? I mean, the book of Hebrews in the Bible says we're done with animal sacrifices. Jesus paid the final sacrifice. Okay. They also taught that Jesus was, when he returns, will rule from the temple, a temple in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. And I said, wait a minute. When Jesus was here on earth, they tried to make him an earthly king. He always refused. This is not in his character. And if Jesus is going to rule from an earthly temple in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, what about the rest of us who go to heaven? We're going to be separated from Jesus in heaven while he's here down on earth for 1,000 years?
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
Yeah, but finally, the main proof on this, the main proof on this comes from the Bible itself. Jesus himself said, and this is Matthew 24, said, if anyone tells you, talking about his second coming, if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Okay, so direct quote from Jesus. Now, our pastors in our evangelical churches were teaching that Jesus was going to be in the inner rooms, directly contrary to what Jesus himself said. Now, who is going to rule from a temple in Jerusalem? And that is answered by St. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. He said, speaking of the end times, he said, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of the lawlessness, meaning the Antichrist, right, is revealed. the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship. So that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. That's who's going to rule from the temple, but it won't be for 1,000 years. It'll probably be for 3.5.
Three and a
as the
half,
book of
right.
Revelation suggests. Right.
Right.
So, but our church was setting us up to worship the Antichrist as Christ. And then the final blow for me was our church announced that today, this was at a Sunday service, at least for part of the service, we're not going to be a church. We're going to be a Jewish synagogue. They passed out noisemakers and said, today we're going to celebrate the Feast of Purim. Now, the Feast of Purim is from the book of Esther, and it's when the Jews celebrate not only their relief from oppression, but also they're celebrating the slaughter of their enemies. And as I looked around in my church, this is an evangelical church, I saw my fellow Christians are blowing horns and dancing and pretending to be Jews in a synagogue. And I said, you know, the Bible says we're not to celebrate Jewish festivals anymore. And I looked across the aisle at another Christian and we just shook our heads. I said, I got to get out of here. I'm done. I can't be in a Zionized church any longer. But I didn't want to go to a modernized Rockefeller church that didn't believe anything. And as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, it's much closer to Orthodoxy. It's sacramental. You know, they have communion. But I knew from talking to conservative Catholics that due to infiltration, and ever since what they call Vatican II in the early 1960s, the Vatican was in serious decline. They had serious troubles. And then finally I discovered Orthodoxy, the elephant in the room. And so let me just discuss why I came to Orthodoxy. Okay.
Please do so, but because the leap is important to me.
Okay. So first of all, the Orthodox Church was not modernized. It was not Zionized. I've never met a Christian Zionist in all the time that I've been in Orthodoxy, and in the 4,000 pages of the Synecdoche there, and never found one Christian Zionist ever. Okay, that's just a phenomenon since 1917. Okay, another thing was that the Orthodox Church worships according to the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom mostly. Sometimes it worships from other liturgies. But it goes back to the original church of the 4th century. And I said, that's how I want to worship. I want to worship the way the original Christians worship. I don't want to spin off of a spin off of Martin Luther. I don't want that. That's not right. Another thing that convinced me was that the worst slaughter of Christians in history has been against Orthodox Christians. According to Synaxarion, between 1918 and 1926, Lenin and Trotsky slaughtered more Orthodox Christians than all the martyrs in all the centuries before. And also, if you look at the Holodomor, which is the slaughter of Ukrainian Christians, 7 million of them between 1932 and 1933 under Stalin, those were Orthodox Christians. Now, I'm not denying that non-Orthodox Christians have been persecuted over the years. That certainly happened. Actually, in my state of Massachusetts or so ago, there was a woman who was hung because she converted to she converted out of the traditional Orthodoxy, traditional Christianity in Massachusetts.
Congregational.
What do they have? What do they have in
the congregational brand
in Pennsylvania?
Quakers.
I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name right now.
Is it Quakers?
It's not, but they hung her for just somebody converting out. So there have been, but the worst. My main point is the worst persecution of Christians. Quaker. That she became a Quaker, so they hung her for becoming a Quaker. But there have been many persecutions, but the worst persecution has been against Orthodox. And I believe that the devil knows who his worst enemy is.
I agree.
But another factor was this. Pretty important, actually. The Orthodox Church uses the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Now, when I was in evangelical churches, I would read in the New Testament where they would quote the Old Testament. They would flip to that passage in the Old Testament and would say something quite different. And I asked some of my friends, I said, how come when Jesus and the apostles quote the Old Testament and you go to the Old Testament, it says something different? And they said, well, that's because we're using the Masoretic text. Well, the Masoretic version of the Old Testament was written 1,000 years approximately after Christ,
right,
by Jewish rabbis. And I said, well, why don't we use the Septuagint? That's what Jesus and the apostles used, and that's what the Orthodox use today. Now, actually, if you read people like Saint Well, however, it's still far more reliable than the Masoretic, which even the King James uses the Masoretic. I know there are people who really worship the King James. I know that from evangelical churches, but also communion. Communion was at the centerpiece of Orthodox liturgy. And but if you go to a Protestant church, they rarely have communion.
right,
They do. It's not, consecrated bread and wine. It's
right.
crackers and grape juice. I
Yes.
don't know how that started. I have to go and look that up, but it wasn't the right type of communion. And which would go on for like 45 minutes, and you fall asleep. Parishes I attend, usually the sermon really isn't more than 5 minutes. They might give a youth sermon and an adult sermon, each constituting about 5 minutes. But the problem with a 40-minute Protestant sermon is that the pastor becomes a centerpiece, not Christ.
Right, yes.
And one final thing that I'll mention, and there are other reasons too, I'm sure, but the fact that Orthodoxy offered a disciplined Christian lifestyle, fasting, which I'm still way behind on. I'm not holding myself up as Orthodox Christianity, but of Orthodox Christianity, but a disciplined lifestyle, which kind of brings us into the book, which I haven't even talked about yet. My book, Missing Saints, Missing Miracles.
That's okay, because we're going to do a part two.
Number one,
this is very important, James. We're going to do a part two on this, so I want you to know that. but because yes, absolutely. No, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Okay,
go on. But
no, not I appreciate you interrupting me. I recently got over a severe respiratory illness, so my throat is not what it usually is. But to explain why I started reading the Synaxarion, the 4,000-page Synaxarion, is because Saint Paisios is probably the most respected saint of in the Greek Orthodox Church in the 20th century. He was a very humble man, lived in a little simple hut on Mount Athos, and thousands of people from the world over came to see him to ask his counsel. Well, one of the things he counseled, I read his spiritual counsels, he said, read from the lives of the saints every day. Now, this is something I had not been doing at all. Even in my parish worship, on the Sunday bulletin, they usually have a little insert on the life of the saint or saints who are being commemorated that day. I wouldn't pay attention. When St. Paisios said that, I said, okay, I got to start. Then I was absolutely stunned. Go ahead.
I'm running out of bandwidth right now, but I want to pick up on this when we go to part two. I'll call you and or I'll get in touch with you so that we can take this up again, because there's just so much here, and unfortunately I'm down to 2 minutes now, and I apologize, but I do want to thank you for taking the time out. I do want to say one thing about the Synaxarion and about your book, because you ended with a list of monasteries in the United States. And I'm sure you've been, I try to go, but during trapezar, during mealtime, usually they have a monk or a nun read from the Synaxarion while we're eating. And I think the Synaxarion is the unsung treasure of the Orthodox Church. And of course, we can't expect anybody to read 4,000 pages. We're glad you did. and if you could hold up your book one more time, Missing Saints, so people can see it and read it and buy it. Of course, I will link it below. And if it's okay, could you just say one more thing before we finish today, because we are going to take this up again, if you don't mind. So if you'd like to say something, got a couple of minutes here, would you be so kind as to?
I'm sorry, I lost you, that last part of what you said.
Oh, we've got a couple of minutes left. If you'd be so kind, would you like to say something that would springboard us onto a part 2 of this? Because obviously this is going to take much longer than what I have. So would you be willing to do that?
Oh yeah, well, the main parts of the book concern missing Christian history. Well,
Right.
They're not missing to the Orthodox necessarily, but they're certainly missing the West. Like what happened to the cross of Christ? No,
Right.
Nobody even asked that the whole time I was in the evangelical churches. The second and most important part is the miracles which were done by saints. And if I can find the quote fast enough. But Jesus said, believe me that I am the Father and the Father in me, or else believe me for the very works' sake. Right. He's obviously talking about miracles. He said, I say unto you, he that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father. Now, what I found in the Synaxarion, that virtually every miracle Jesus did, short of the resurrection itself, was done by post-biblical saints.
Yes.
And I categorize these by miracle, and I list the saints who did them, and according to when and where. That's probably the most important part of the book. But I also talk a lot about Western Christianity and where it went wrong over the years and how I got misled by Western Christianity. By the way, I know that we only have maybe a few seconds left, but I want to talk to you after the recording is done.
Sure.
About when we'll be doing part 2.
Okay. Hold on. And I will. Okay.